It wasn't exactly a typical weekend, but I wasn't expecting it to be as memorable and traumatic as it was. At the time, I was a programmer helping to develop a new English learning app for a company, and being fluent in both English and Portuguese made me an ideal candidate for the job. Fortunately, I was allowed to work remotely from Sao Paulo, so I didn't have to visit Rio very often. However, the company wanted me to meet the rest of the team, so I was obligated to go. The tourist hotspots in Rio are nice, but also very expensive and can be easy targets for dangerous criminals. I guess they figured out that robbing foreigners is more profitable than robbing the locals. The hotel I decided to stay at was shabby and quite far from the city centre, but it was affordable and definitely low-key. There wasn't that much security, so pretty much anyone could walk in and out at any time, but I wasn't too worried since I was only planning to stay there for one night, and I was travelling very light. Despite the relatively short flight from Sao Paulo to Rio, I was already feeling tired, but just as I was about to recharge my phone and head on to bed, I received an unexpected call on the landline phone. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but when answering a call from a stranger, I prefer to just stay quiet and let them do the talking and just hang up if I decide it's a conversation not worth having. So I picked up the phone and waited silently on the line.
Eu sei onde você está. Se você tenta sair do seu quarto, você vai morrer.
Before I had a chance to hang up, the call already ended abruptly, leaving me in a state of fear and confusion. I didn't really know whether I should stay put or go somewhere else, somewhere crowded. Either way, I didn't feel that I had enough time to call the police and explain what was going on, or if they would even be able to respond in time. I began to suspect that perhaps someone spotted me at the airport and followed me to the hotel. But why the threatening phone call? Why not just go directly to my room? The more time I spent thinking about it, I felt increasingly less safe in the room by myself, but as I turned off the lights and headed to the door, I heard a scream followed by commotion coming from the hallway. I stepped away from the door and hid behind the bed as I observed shadows beneath the door that appeared to show people desperately running for the exit. Suddenly the screams turned to panic as a man started yelling and cursing like an insane person. And once again I could see shadows quickly passing beneath the door, but this time they were oddly heading away from the exit. I remember there was an intense moment of silence before eventually someone began violently banging and kicking against the door, desperately trying to force their way in.
Abre essa porta! Abre agora!
At that point I was convinced that it was only a matter of time before the door would eventually break down, but to my relief, everything went quiet and I could no longer see the shadow of anyone standing behind the door. It felt too soon to enter the hallway. Something didn't feel right, as if the crazy tormented person was still out there, waiting. I tried to contact the clerk at the front desk of the hotel to find out what was going on, but the phone there was off the hook for some reason. It seemed like the only thing left to do was to call the police, but suddenly the fire alarm began sounding off, and I could hear a steady flow of footsteps hurtling down the corridor. I eventually managed to rack up the courage to vacate my room and head down to the small lobby. By the time the police arrived, everyone, myself included, had already spilled out onto the streets after hearing the fire alarm, and there was still a strong sense of panic and confusion in the air. The police searched the hotel, but there was no sign of the man or any clues as to what scared him off or who set off the fire alarm. According to what I overheard from fellow tourists and hotel staff, about a dozen people had all vacated their rooms and scrambled onto the roof to avoid a man with a knife. Apparently he was looking for someone, but since he didn't know which room they were staying at, he assaulted the clerk at the front desk and began calling all of the rooms. I consider myself very lucky that the door to my room didn't give in, and for whatever reason he gave up when he did. I haven't been back to Rio since, but it was definitely an experience that I'll never forget, and I sincerely hope that the crazy man with the knife was found and is no longer a threat to anyone.
This story is inspired by true events, so I won't be using any specific names or places. It was a cold winter night, about 12 years ago when it happened. Driving home late one night after a get-together with some old buddies of mine. I was a little worried about the icy roads since it had been snowing all day, so I was mindful of my speed and general handling of my custom 1971 Chevy. The radio was busted and I was dying for a smoke, and I couldn't ignore the eerie sense of isolation I was feeling on this particular stretch of road. Come to think of it, I hadn't seen another car for miles, which is why I was surprised to see something in the middle of the road just up ahead. By the time I realized what I was looking at, I feared it was already too late, as I slammed on the brakes and braced for impact. This was all followed by a sudden blanket of silence. Even with the engine still running, I couldn't hear anything. But I could feel the cold from outside. My eyes were still closed at this point, trying frantically to summon up the courage to open them, but when I did, I was shocked at what I saw. She had not moved or reacted in any way since I first spotted her in the middle of the road, and she didn't appear to acknowledge my presence whatsoever. My first impression was how improperly dressed she was for the weather, and that she must have been freezing. I looked around to see if there was a bar or restaurant nearby where she might have come from, but I knew the area pretty well, and there was nothing around here except for a payphone and a gas station a few miles down the road. I had seen some pretty weird things on Friday nights before, back in the day, but this really topped them all, and this whole thing started to give me the creeps. I didn't want to startle her by beeping the horn, but before I got around to figuring out what to do next, she began slowly walking forward. That's when I realized she was without any shoes and began walking barefoot on the snow at the side of the road, which I thought was crazy. I began cruising alongside her to try to get her attention, but my efforts were just ignored. She seemed pretty out of it, and I began to assume that drugs were involved. But I couldn't just leave her alone out in the cold. It was only when I beeped the horn for a third time that she finally stopped, and just stood there quietly in the snow. I hesitated for a while, but decided to get out of the car and try to help. But just as I opened the door and stepped out, she simply vanished, out of sight. The only sign of life was the eerie cawing of crows from above, which just made everything feel even more creepy. I walked over to where I had last seen her, and there was no one there. This next part was what really got me spooked. When I looked down to my right, I was completely shocked when I realized that there were no footprints in the snow. After about a minute of just standing at the side of the road like an idiot, I got back into my car and tried to make sense of it all. I had to get out of there, so I quickly drove away and continued down the road. Even after a mile or so, I just couldn't get it out of my head. I tried to approach it at every angle, but it just left me with more questions than answers. Anyway, I was eager to get home and sleep it off. But just when I thought the worst of the evening was behind me, I saw something on the side of the road. Instinctively, I already reduced my speed to avoid any more close calls, and was horrified to discover that it was a car that had swerved off the road and was now partially submerged under the snow. Deep down, I was hoping that the accident happened a while back and that the emergency services had already been there. But I was terrified to realize that I was the first on the scene when I spotted a body slumped over in the driver's seat. I wasn't prepared to see a dead body that night, or on any other night. And I certainly wasn't prepared to see such a familiar stranger. Landing a job at the local theatre is definitely one of the highlights of 2022 so far, for me at least, especially considering how bad things were last year. The theatre is a small family-owned franchise and had been hit pretty hard by the pandemic, so the turnouts are still quite low, but I enjoy the job a lot, even when it means working late hours on occasion. This just happened a few weeks ago during the midnight premiere of the new Scream movie that just released. The late shifts always felt a bit spooky, and with rumours circulating that the theatre was haunted, didn't really make me feel less anxious about working so late. Nobody really knows for sure how the rumours started, but the theatre was a very old building with a lot of history, so I wasn't surprised to hear the odd ghost story now and then. Around 30 minutes into the premiere, I closed the ticket booth and locked the main entrance, something we would always do for the final showings, and just let people out around the back as soon as the movie finished. I spent most of my time after that near the snack bar, occasionally helping myself to the soda fountain. There was not that much else to do since the rest of the staff had already gone home and my boss just stayed in his office. The night seemed to drag on forever, but eventually at around 2 AM in the morning, people started spinning out into the hallway, eager to get home. Naturally, everyone was trying to leave the theatre the same way they came in, so I had to draw their attention to the exit around the back, and as soon as everyone left, I closed and locked the door. The only thing left to do at that point was to clean up the cinema, which I didn't expect to take too long considering there were only a handful of people who showed up to watch the premiere. However, when I went inside, I was surprised to see that someone wearing a black hoodie had decided to stay for the end credits. Not too common for a horror movie, especially since everyone else was so eager to get home, and I don't remember seeing anyone with a black hoodie at the ticket booth that night. Initially, I just continued cleaning up popcorn from the floor and binning empty sodas, but what struck me as odd was that even after the credits had ended and the curtains had closed, the person was still just sitting there. My next obvious conclusion was that he or she had fallen asleep. I mean, it was late. But then again, who falls asleep during a horror flick? I usually watch them to help me stay awake. As I got closer, I tried to make as much noise with my steps as possible in an attempt to get a reaction, but to no avail, and when I kindly asked the person to leave, I was met with an awkward, eerie silence. I tried to get a glimpse of the person's face, but as I did so, the hooded stranger turned away in the opposite direction. The whole thing started giving me the creeps, so I left the cinema to get my boss, but as I entered the hallway, I was shocked to see the door to the back entrance was open. I have no explanation for this because I am 100% sure I had closed and locked it and the key was with me the whole time. Luckily, I managed to close and lock it again before my boss even noticed. I already left the front door open once and he gave me an earful. Anyway, I told him about the person who was still inside the cinema and he got pissed that I was bothering him about something so trivial, and he asked me to get back in there and deal with it while he finished up. I agreed and headed back, only to find that the cinema was now completely empty. I checked all the bathrooms, the hallway and the lobby and didn't find anyone. When my boss asked me about it, I lied and told him that I took care of it, but to be honest, I can't really explain what happened that night. The crazy thing is, one of the seats to that cinema keeps folding down even after folding it up repeatedly throughout the day, and it's the exact same place that I saw the stranger in the hoodie. The only person I've told about this is my friend Ben, who works with me at the cinema. And after hearing the story for the first time, he seemed really confused when I told him about the curtains closing at the end of the movie, and what he mentioned next was really creepy. He went on to say that I was the only person on duty that night apart from the boss. So who was it that closed the curtains? In spite of the events that unfolded that night and my increasingly belief that the theatre really is haunted, I still show up to work every day. But I know that I will be extra vigilant and perhaps a little more prepared for the next midnight premiere, especially when it's a horror movie.
Daddy, please wake up. There's something wrong with Mommy. Daddy, please, wake up. Daddy,
It was the 1-year anniversary since that night. I know it sounds rather extreme, but I didn't even feel comfortable parking too close to the house. My therapist told me that the best way to deal with the recurring nightmares was to face up to what scares me the most. So here I was, back at that house. I wanted to phone my daughter just so I could hear her voice and make sure she was okay. But the cell phone coverage was always sketchy in that area. In many ways, my daughter had been the stronger one through all of it, even after her mother was taken away. Perhaps it was because she was still shielded from the harsh reality of what really happened, still just a child in the face of something so terrifying. For a brief second, I almost knocked on the door as if I was expecting someone to be home. That's when it really occurred to me. Home was no longer home anymore, just an empty shell of a house haunted by memories. Maybe coming back wasn't such a good idea, but as I stepped away, I heard the front door creak open slightly. Whether I cared to admit it or not, I couldn't deny that deep down I was waiting for a sign that I was doing the right thing, and maybe this was it, just a hint of encouragement that I needed to get my foot in the door. I could already sense the old musky smell of a vacant house as I gently pushed the door further open, revealing the staircase and the clutter of toys and unopened mail scattered across the floor. I proceeded upstairs where the nightmare began, still so fresh in my mind, a memory of being woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of my daughter's desperate voice.
Daddy, please wake up.
I ask myself every day, why us? Why our family? And what was she doing in Maddie's room? What my daughter once considered the safest room in the house became a chamber of screams, cursing, things I care not to recollect. Her old room was an uncanny reminder of the torment and suffering. What was I doing here? What did I really hope to achieve by coming here? So many questions, yet very few answers. I did my best to keep everything quiet. I even contacted the church, but they weren't willing to get involved without proof of a demonic entity, so she was taken away and labeled with a mental disorder. Where do I go from here? I really can't say. I put the house up for sale not too long ago. Maybe it sells, maybe it doesn't. But I'll never forget the terror of that fateful night at that house.
Daddy, please wake up. There's something wrong with Mommy.